I sort of already explained it. So if P goes up and A goes up, so I just want to point out that P, which remember that was population, and A was GDP divided by population. So P times A is really just GDP. P, population times GDP divided by population, you cancel. So P and A is really GDP. If that goes up, and let's say R is unchanged, then the footprint will go up. If R goes down and let's say P and A were to remain unchanged, then that's, in other words, if GDP was unchanged, F would go down. All right. But if P and A together go up, so if GDP goes up at a rate greater than R comes down, so so when those two go up, that pushes F up. When that goes down, that pushes F down. But if that exceeds the impact of improving or reducing the resource intensity of economic activity, the footprint will go up. Well, this is what's been happening globally over the last 50 years. So let me show a figure of P, A, R and F. We've already seen F, but I'll show it again, what's been happening. So population from 1961 to 2014, so this is on a global level. Population's been rising. In fact, it's virtually doubled over that period of time. A has been rising. Now, of course, it's called, at the global level, it's not called gross domestic product, it's called gross world product. It's on a per capita basis. That's, apart from the odd year here and there, that's been rising, and that's basically doubled over that same 53-year period. R has been falling. So the resources used to produce $1 worth of gross world product has been falling. We're not using as many resources to produce $1 worth of gross world product, but we are using more resources. The footprint has been rising because that's virtually halved. But remember, the population's doubled, that's 2, times A has doubled, times 2 is 4, times half is 2. That's why footprint has doubled. So footprint, that's just the same diagram I had before. The footprint was the blue line. That's basically doubled. So it's 2 times half. So R hasn't been going down as quickly as P and A have been rising. So the footprint has been increasing over the last, and has basically doubled over the last 53 years. And I'll just make sure I didn't leave something. So yeah, the overall effect, F gone up because P has gone up, A has gone up, R's gone down. Yeah, so it's 2 times 0.5 is 2. So F has gone up twofold. Because of the growth in P and A, F is rising. So it's growth. So we might be using resources technically more efficiently, but growth, and it's not just per capita GDP, it's population. Population's the key. In fact, if population had been what it was in 1961, in 2014, it would have been 1 times 2 times half, which would have been 1. I was at one of the United Nations climate change conferences a few years ago, and I raised the issue of population, and I said, well, if the population hadn't doubled in the last 50 years, we probably wouldn't be all here. It was in Bonn in Germany, talking about what we can do to deal with climate change, because if everything else was the same, if we had the same population we had 50 years ago, which was half what it is now, total greenhouse gas emissions would be half what they were at the time, which was a few years ago. Everything's made more difficult if population's higher. All right, so eco-taxes would help reduce R, which we've seen is useful, but would do nothing to limit the increase in P and A. They do nothing to limit the increase in P and A, so they do nothing to limit the growth of GDP. So eco-taxes cannot therefore guarantee a reduction in F if currently F is greater than B, which it is at the global footprint's greater than biocapacity, even if R is falling, which it is. Nor could it even, so if we go back to 1961, you've got this situation. So eco-taxes can't prevent F from rising above B, which it did by about 1970, if currently, or if that was 1961, F was less than B, which it was, even if F was falling, which it was. So eco-taxes cannot ensure ecological sustainability. Guaranteeing ecological sustainability requires quantitative restrictions on the rate of resource use and waste generation, direct regulation. That's the only way you can do it. The thing is, a central government need not be a currency issuing central government to impose such restrictions. You don't have to. So the Italian government could place restrictions on the amount of saw logs that are, or trees that are cut from their forests, or fish caught from their fisheries and so forth. So a monetary sovereignty, which is, we're talking about a currency issuing central government, is not necessary to achieve sustainability. So I would argue that modern monetary theory is, in so much as it highlights the distinction between what a currency issuing central government can do and what a currency using central government can do and can't do, is not particularly relevant, because whether the central government is a currency issuer or a currency user, they can impose the necessary restrictions to achieve ecological sustainability. But it's what economy you're left with that matters, and that's where the insights of MMT become important. Now, what could you do? Well, you could just have restrictions on the rate of resource use and waste generation to achieve ecological sustainability, so you satisfy those 4 sustainability precepts. But that still raises the question, who gets to use the resources, who gets to generate the waste? And you don't just want to give them to anyone, you want to give them to those firms, because you and I don't, I've never bought a saw log in my life, but I've bought wooden products. Okay, so the people or the organisations that access resources are producers. Right? They pay for resources and then they convert them into goods and services that we subsequently purchase. And of course it results in waste, both in production and consumption. So ecological economists, I guess I'm putting on my ecological economist hat here, argue for cap auction trade systems, CATs. What would that involve? Well, that would mean you'd place caps on the rate of resource use and rate of waste generation to ensure ecological sustainability. And caps would exist in the form of a limited number of issued permits. So to generate a tonne of greenhouse gas emissions, you'd need to have a permit, assuming one permit. So one permit might be, so you have permits for different types of resources and different forms of waste. So you might have one permit equals 1 cubic tonne of saw logs. So if a firm needs 1 tonne of saw logs to produce wooden furniture, it would have to buy a permit, which would forfeit. So you would have, say, a forestry company would extract a tonne of, in fact, before it goes to the furniture manufacturer, it'd probably go to a timber processor. So perhaps it's the timber processor that would have to buy the permits. But they would forfeit the permit once they've accessed or acquired the 1 cubic tonne of saw logs. And then you could have a situation on the waste side, 1 permit equals 1 tonne of CO2 emissions. Yep.
Sorry, that needs to be broken down even further into whether it's hewn and pine.
Yeah, of course, yes. Oh yeah, that's just very basic. So you would have, and it would depend on the location as well. So you can have certain timber that grows faster in one part of the world or one part of the country or one state relative to another and so forth. But basically caps keep F less than or equal to B. So this aspect, now it's interesting because a lot of people talk about cap auction trade systems as a market instrument to achieve. Wrong. There is a market-based element, and I'll get to that. That part is the regulation. And it's not determined by demand and supply, it's determined by what needs to be, what the rate of resource use and rate of waste generation should be to be within ecological limits. It's based on ecological grounds, and the caps have nothing to do with markets whatsoever. They are determined on an ecological basis. Then the permits are initially auctioned by a government authority. Permits can then be bought and sold in permit markets. Now there's been a lot of talk about how this can lead to speculation and people just buy permits because, if you're limiting the supply of something, that usually pushes up its price. So someone buys a permit and watches the permit price go up, and they don't buy the permit to access resources, but simply, permits would have a limited life. Say they might expire if unused. So you have to give them up, of course. So if you emit a tonne of greenhouse gases, you've got to give up a permit. So to emit 5 tonnes, you need 5 permits. But if they're unused at the end of, say, 1 year, that's it. They expire. And it means that new batches of permits would be auctioned every year, which would allow the government authority... Well, not only does it prevent speculation, it allows, of course, the authority to vary the number of issued permits in light of data on ecological resource system changes, because that's changing all the time, or the need to cut levels. For example, we need to gradually cut CO2 emissions. So you would, each year, you would auction off fewer and fewer permits so that you meet your Paris targets and so forth. Well, in fact, go beyond that, because the Paris agreement on climate change is insufficient to ensure we limit the rise in global temperatures to 2 degrees above the pre-industrial level. The important thing about so you've got to purchase these permits if you want to access resources or you want to generate pollution. So remember, this is not about getting rid of... You can't get rid of pollution. Remember the diagram? Resources in means waste comes out. It's a matter of how much pollution and the nature of it. That's the key thing. And limiting it to what the natural environment can safely assimilate. Now, the natural environment does have the ability to assimilate and absorb wastes. Now, the important thing is that the prices that you would have to pay for permits would serve as a tax. So they work like a tax, but it's a bit different to just eco-taxes, because eco-taxes don't involve the cap. This is the cap, and the price being paid for the permit acts like the tax. So the prices that you pay for permits serve as taxes on resource use and waste generation. Now, of course, there's a demand side of markets and the supply side. And a lot of this is not fully understood. On the demand side, people just look at the demand side. They neglect the supply side. They think, okay, it would mean that what this would do, it would increase the price of high pollution-intensive and resource-intensive goods and services, right? Because to produce them, the firms would have to buy lots of permits, and of course that would increase the cost of production, and of course they would pass that on in terms of the price of final goods and services. So most people recognise that. People just automatically assume that that will be supplied. If we demand this instead of that, low-intensive, carbon-intensive goods rather than high carbon-intensive goods, the low carbon-intensive goods or electricity will be supplied. Okay, it's likely to be supplied by the private sector if those goods have what economists refer to as private goods characteristics. The 2 main characteristics of goods that determines whether a good is a private good or a public good is not who ends up supplying the good, although the private sector is usually good at supplying private goods but not very good at supplying insufficient quantities of public goods, so governments need to do that. But that's not the real reason why they're called private and public goods. What goods have? They have 2 main features. One of them is the non-rivalry of consumption or use. What does that mean? Okay. Think of an apple. Someone eating an apple? Yeah. There's rivalry in the consumption of an apple. Here's an apple. I eat it. You can't eat it. That's it. If I got on a train today, there were other people on the train. So when I walked onto the train, not everyone had to get off. All right. There was no rivalry in the use of the train. Private goods, there is a rivalry. With public goods, there's not. So think of a lighthouse. Okay, if you're getting use of a lighthouse on a stormy day, you're out on a boat, your ability to get services from the lighthouse doesn't affect someone else's ability to obtain services from the lighthouse. Then there's the non-excludability of consumption or use. Okay, what does that mean? With private goods, it means, so think of the apple again. Okay, so I'm a shop shopkeeper, I own a fruit and veg shop. I can exclude you from having this apple if you don't pay for it. Okay, you can try and steal it, I guess, but basically you have to pay for it. And if you don't, I can exclude you from having access to it. With public goods, there is non-excludability of consumption and use, which means, take for example the lighthouse. It might be a stormy day, I'm out on my boat and I make use of the lighthouse. We've got to assume now the lighthouse has, if it's going to be built, it's going to be built by a privately owned firm. How is it going to make me pay for the services I gain from the lighthouse? It can't. I might, and there might be a boat floating around. Well, they can't force me. They can't issue licences. Governments have that ability, but privately owned firms can't do that. So everyone goes around, uses the services, takes advantage of the services of the lighthouse, doesn't pay for it. It costs money, so to speak, to access the resources to build a lighthouse, so it's going to cost you something. You don't earn any revenue. It's not profitable. Private sector doesn't supply public goods in sufficient quantities. Who can do it? A government, in particular, a currency issuing central government, because it has no financing constraint. So we rely heavily upon currency issuing central governments to provide public goods. So that's why governments provide a lot of goods, so-called goods, in the area of health, education, transport, communications and so forth. The private sector less so. It's not profitable. It's not that the private sector being nasty and mean and horrible, it's not profitable. It doesn't matter if it doesn't have to be profitable if you're a currency issuing central government. You can run at a loss. So it's one thing for us to demand low carbon electricity because to produce it, firms have to buy permits and that pushes the price of high carbon intensive electricity upwards, but someone's got to supply it. And if the infrastructure that's required to supply it has public goods characteristics, it won't be supplied unless it's been supplied by a government. And if that government has to be a currency issuing central government, but it's the Italian government, it's going to have difficulty supplying it. Which means if you're operating sustainably, it means it's going to perhaps limit the sorts of things you can do, the sort of economy that you can have. So this is where the insights of modern monetary theory become important. It's not so much what you have to do to ensure ecological sustainability. That just requires these throughput constraints. Any government can do that. State governments, local governments, well, they probably don't think local governments would have the constitutional power to do that, but achieving sustainability is not an easy thing to do, but assuming you can do it, the sort of economy you're left with will depend very heavily upon the nation having a currency issuing central government, being aware that it has the fiscal capacity to provide public goods and other things so that we can maintain a reasonable material standard of living, particularly because I mentioned that 2 out of 3 countries have an ecological footprint greater than their biocapacity. They're going to have to reduce their natural resource use, meaning they may have to reduce their GDP. Yeah, adequate provision of low resource intensive and low pollution intensive public goods, especially infrastructure, will depend on government investment spending. The same also with regards to R&D into green technologies. Not a financing problem if the central government is a currency issuing central government. It is a potential financing problem if the central government is not a monetary sovereign, e.g. Eurozone, nation, state and provincial governments. So permit prices, a bit like taxes, help reduce R, the resource intensity, pollution intensity of economic activity, but maximum reduction in R is still dependent on government investment in low resource intensive and low pollution intensive infrastructure and technologies. So MMT knowledge. Maximum reduction in R is dependent upon the central government being a CICG, currency issuing central government, and the central government exploiting its fiscal capacities to provide the necessary green infrastructure. Why is this significant? I've sort of pointed out that it determines what sort of economy you're left with, and the way to show that is, okay, here's my FPAR. Remember P times A? That was population times GDP divided by population, so the 2 was the same as GDP. So it was just, okay. We can rearrange that, all right, that F, So we can write it as R is equal to F on GDP, or we can write it as GDP is F on R. Okay. Let's say that we know that F must be quantitatively limited to ensure F is less than or equal to B. How much GDP a nation can ecologically sustain will depend on what happens to R. Depends on the value of R. Okay, so GDP, what that value is, given that you have to limit the F, will depend on the value of R. So assume the following. Okay, let's say the footprint involves resources embodying, I'm just using some number, but let's say 1,000 units of matter and energy. The resources that we're using to produce the GDP constitutes the footprint, and let's say it embodies 1,000 units of matter and energy. Let's say that the GDP, the goods and services that we produce, end up as equal to 500. In other words, embodies 500 units of matter and energy. So remember, you get resources and you transform them into goods and services. So the matter and energy embodied in the resources ends up in the goods and services, but not all of it. Some of it immediately becomes production waste. You are going to have some production waste. In this situation, production waste would just be the difference between 1,000 and 500, be 500. So technically, you'd have an efficiency rate of 50%, meaning of the matter and energy embodied in the resources used to produce goods, 50% goes into the goods and 50% immediately becomes waste. Eventually that 500 in the goods and services becomes waste. Remember, what goes in is what goes, but immediately some already becomes waste, and eventually the stuff embodied in physical goods becomes waste. All right, so if that was what was happening, then R would be equal to F, which is 1,000 divided by 500 equals 2. So we'd basically have the resource intensity of production would be equal to 2, meaning that for every 1 unit of matter and energy embodied in GDP produced, we've had to exploit and use resources embodying two units. All right. I just want to point out, I won't go into the first and second laws of thermodynamics, but they forbid R being less than or equal to 1. It's got to be greater than 1. Why? There cannot be more matter and energy embodied in the GDP produced, the goods that you produce, than the matter and energy embodied in the natural resources that you're transforming into GDP. All right, if you had more in the GDP than in the resources, you'd be creating matter and energy, which would violate the first law. The second law, the entropy law, means that there's always going to be some production waste. There's always going to be, so if that's 1,000, this can't be 1,000. You can't have 100%, there's got to be some waste. In fact, technological progress enables you to reduce the amount of waste. So through technological progress, which we've had in the last 50 odd years, remember R was going down. It means that, say, for 50 years ago, remember it halved the resource intensity of economic activity. So if that's what it was in 2014, that would have been about 250 in 1961. So 750 was waste, and only 250 of the 1,000 units of matter and energy ended up in the, now it's 5, which of course means you can produce more GDP for the same amount of resources used. All right. Okay.
And the same with recycling waste.
Yes.
Second law consideration means that you can't 100% recycle your waste.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you can't. So when I had that recycling, that you can't recycle all the waste back, and you can't recycle energy at all. Okay. Remember, F has to be less than or equal to B. Okay. So F is equal to 1,000, but let's just say that B is 800. Then we have to reduce F to 800 at the very least to achieve ecological sustainability. Remember, F has to be less than or equal to B, and 1,000 is greater than 800. That's unsustainable. Footprint greater than biocapacity. B was biocapacity, by the way. So we have to reduce footprint at the very least to 800. Could be something less, but maybe you don't want to be right on the ecological precipice in terms of sustainability. But let's say F equal to B is sufficient to ensure ecological sustainability. If R remains at 2, so there's no technological progress that reduces the resource intensity of economic activity, then GDP is going to be 800 divided by 2 is 400. So the maximum sustainable GDP is 400. So if you're in a situation, those 2/3 of all countries on the planet that are producing 500, say, GDP, but your footprint is in excess of biocapacity, you've got to reduce your footprint, so it's again equal to biocapacity, and you don't do anything about R, then the maximum sustainable GDP will fall. Well, in fact, no, it won't fall. Maximum is 400. It wasn't sustainable before. 500 was unsustainable. 400 is now sustainable. So if GDP needs to remain at, and I did say that GDP is not an end in itself, but it's a means to an end, but let's just assume that GDP needs to remain at around 500 to achieve a nation's ends goals. So I'm still describing as a means to various ends and goals. In other words, to maintain economic welfare, the nation must reduce R to 800 divided by 500. So that's what it's got to reduce its footprint to. If it's got to maintain GDP at 500, it's got to reduce its resource intensity of economic activity from 2 to 1.6. Yeah. If it's going to do that. MMT understanding of the fiscal capacities of a currency issuing central government is necessary to maintain economic welfare should the rate of throughput, that's natural resource input, and, D missing, waste, need to be limited, reduced. So if we need to keep GDP around 5, not have to grow up, but keep it at 500, if we don't do anything about R, get that down, then the maximum we can sustain is 400 and there's a loss of economic welfare. And of course, to get that down, I've pointed out, it's not just enough to have a price on resource use, pollution and so forth. Your private sector will provide some of the goods, but the government's going to have to provide a lot of the green infrastructure needed to get R down, and the R&D in green technology to get R down to, say, 1.6. And that will be difficult if a government, or the central government, of the country is not a currency issuer, if it's a currency user. It's much easier if it's a currency issuer. It doesn't have a financing issue. Now, that's a welfare implication. What about equity implications, income distribution? So it's the cap auction trade system. Well, another aspect of it, because the price is initially paid to acquire auction permits, so remember you've got to get a permit to be able to access resources or to generate pollution, serve as resource use taxes and pollution taxes, in other words, eco taxes, just generally. What they do, those permit prices, they destroy some of this, because they act like a tax, they destroy some of the spending power of the individuals and organisations engaged in the production and consumption of high resource intensive and high pollution intensive goods and services. So if you want to keep producing them, or you want to keep consuming them, because to produce them, permits have to be purchased, that increase the cost of production, it's going to be added to the you're going to have to pay more for them. And that's effectively just less money you have available to purchase other things, just like a tax. You know, tax reduces the spending power to purchase other things. So it's going to serve like a tax. It's going to destroy some spending power. Now, of course, you can avoid the eco taxes. In fact, if the system's working well, people will avoid it, because that's the aim of the system. You don't want people paying the taxes, because if the people are paying the taxes, it means that they're not switching from the high intensive, high pollutive, high resource intensive to the low. So and the government doesn't need the taxes if it's a central government. So it's not, or it doesn't need so the revenue from the permit, it's not really receiving any revenue anyway. It's got as much money as it likes if it's a currency issuing central government. So it's possible to avoid eco taxes to a large extent by shifting spending towards low resource intensive and low pollution intensive goods and services, which is the aim of the system. You won't be able to avoid it completely, because even if it's not zero, it's low, so you'll still be paying a little bit extra. CATs are not designed to raise revenue to finance government spending or redistribute to the populace. If the central government is a CICG, currency issuing central government, it already has the fiscal capacity to do this. It's got the money to spend or hand money out to people, like it's doing now. So the destruction of some spending power, what it does do is allows a currency issuing central government to reduce income tax rates on low income people, if it wanted to do this, which would narrow the income gap between rich and poor, plus protect the people most vulnerable to the impact of eco taxes, the poor, because the price of things would go up. Why would it allow a government to do that, not because it raises money, but because, remember, one of the purposes of taxation, we're all trying to access these real resources. We've got to purchase them. If I have a permit system and it reduces I'm the central government, you're the general population and the businesses and so forth. If I reduce your spending power, that's going to free up some real resources. Well, then I say, okay, people over here are poorer. I'll reduce your income taxes. So, in a sense, you're getting some of that back, and you can access those freed up resources without it being inflationary. Okay, so it can help from an equity point of view. So equity is about what is fair and just. It has a moral foundation. Outcomes with a moral foundation take precedence over benefit cost considerations. I don't know if you saw the Q&A on Monday night, where there was... well, I felt sorry for Gigi, I've got to say. But she didn't help herself. But basically saying, Australia shouldn't have had all these restrictions because the costs have exceeded the benefits. But of course, it's meant that instead of having, 100 odd deaths, if we had followed what Sweden had done, which is what Gigi was recommending, we'd have 25,000 deaths. That's when you just put aside benefit cost considerations and say, well, a life is worth more than $1. So when you're talking about things with a moral foundation, then you're talking about something that ought to be done irrespective of what it means in terms of benefits and costs. One important aspect is unemployment. Unemployment leads to social exclusivity and contributes enormously to mental illness, homelessness, substance abuse, crime, family breakdown, physical and sexual abuse. So the failure of the last 45 years to provide paid work to everyone who desires it is, in my opinion, a moral failure of society, particularly after what I said earlier on, that the federal government has got the money to put any idle resource, whether that be a natural resource, form of human-made capital, plant machinery, or a human being, to use. So there's no excuse for unemployment. So, as mentioned earlier, MMT informs us that a currency-issuing central government can always use its fiscal capacity to achieve and maintain full employment. Because achieving ecological sustainability will place limits on the growth in a nation's GDP and may even lead to declines in GDP or degrowth. So some countries, in order to operate sustainably, may have to have lower GDP. So the importance of something like a job guarantee will be greater than ever. And in fact, so much so that may have to be supplemented by higher income taxes, not necessarily on everyone, but quite possibly, it depends on how you do things, on the rich to fit everyone in a restricted GDP. Remember, the GDP is like a piece of cake. So if the cake's smaller, then and we want everyone to have a reasonable share of it, and one of the ways you give people a share of it is you do it via work through a job guarantee. Not everyone's going to get the necessary minimum size slice of cake if the cake is shrunk. The only way you can do that is those people who normally get a really big slice of cake, you're going to have to reduce the slice of cake that they get, and that's the rich. So you may have to do that if you're a country that has to experience degrowth. So some conclusions. Achieving ecological sustainability will require quantitative limits on the rate of resource use and waste generation. That can be achieved whether or not the central government is a currency issuing central government. That's irrelevant. The knowledge and understanding of MMT is not necessary to achieve ecological sustainability. MMT is not growth inducing. Again, if it's got nothing to do with sustainability, it's got nothing to do with growth either. Operating an ecologically sustainable economy will place restrictions on GDP and may lead to reductions in GDP, degrowth. How much GDP will decline to operate sustainably and what impact this might have on economic welfare will depend on how efficiently we can use the sustainable incoming resource flow. If we have to limit those resources going in, how big that economy is, how much stuff we can produce will depend on how efficiently we use those resources. This will depend to a large extent on a currency issuing central government investment in green infrastructure, given that much of that infrastructure will possess public goods characteristics. It will possess public goods characteristics. So the private sector won't supply in sufficient quantities. Restrictions on GDP will also increase the importance of redistribution That's going to be really important. And of course make the need for a job guarantee greater than ever, which is just a guaranteed job for anyone looking for a job, wanting a job, who can't obtain one in the private sector and conventional public sector. The government offers a job guaranteed job at a minimum living wage, not for the dole, but something which would probably be around $40,000 a year. If I had my way, all welfare payments would be around that $40,000 a year. So, because obviously some people can't work. For those who are physically and mentally incapable of working, they get $40,000 pension or welfare payment. I'd also have the tax-free threshold at $40,000 as well. I don't see why anyone should be paying tax up for the first $40,000. It's pointless. Okay, a knowledge and understanding of MMT and the crucial role of currency-issuing central governments will also be greater than ever to achieve ecological sustainability in an equitable and welfare-friendly manner. And that's it.